So my name is Nnenna. It's Igbo, it means father's mother. And I was born a bit after my dad's mother died. And so, like in Igbo culture, if in the same family somebody dies and is born so quickly together, we kind of believe that it's the same person coming back. And so her name was Deborah. So my middle name was Deborah. And then, so my dad is Nigerian, my mother is Ghanaian, and I grew up in Ghana. And so there was a lot of like mispronunciation of my name. And so to kind of avoid that, sometimes I would just use my middle name, Deborah. This is getting to be a very long story, but also with kind of both became British colonies, and during colonization there was the sense that you had to have a proper Christian first name. So it was more common for people to have like the Christian name be the first name and the local name be the middle name. So it also happened that once when I went to renew my passport, it just changed and they made Nnenna my middle name and Deborah or Debbie the first name. So I haven't legally been able to change that back yet. So sometimes there's this like mistake or kind of mismatch that legally now, like the first name that I've always had is now my middle name. So I was born in Nigeria, in Lagos, and was there for the first 3 years of my life. And then my parents split, and so my mother moved us to Ghana, where she's from. So I grew up with my mother and my 4 older siblings. First in this small town called Akosombo, and then we moved to Accra. My parents are both doctors, so my dad is a gynecologist and my mother is a dentist. Yeah, and growing up, I think I had a nice childhood. My siblings are kind of much older than I am. And so on the one hand, we never really played together or anything, and we're much closer as adults. But on the other hand, I always felt kind of looked after and taken care of by them. So it was a nice childhood, I would say. There was definitely that sense of like, where it wasn't cool to be Nigerian. Or sometimes, I don't know, I felt like I would even be teased for I had a Ghanaian middle name, another one which my mother put there kind of as an identifier so that people would recognize me, even if my first and last name were Nigerian. But there was still kind of this strangeness with being different. I think it's changing a bit nowadays because kind of Nollywood, the Nigerian film industry, and also Nigerian music is very popular everywhere. So it's not that it's gone away, but now it's like you have 2 extremes where on the one hand it's like very cool, and on the other hand you still have these associated stereotypes with it. I've had people say that it's kind of like that the 2 countries are kind of like siblings who kind of fight a lot within each other but protect themselves from other people. So they're not even neighboring countries in West Africa. There's Togo and Benin in between. But they are like 2 of a handful of English-speaking countries. And so very closely related in that sense. Historically, I think I could say like there was a period, for instance, where in both countries where like the economy has been hard. In Nigeria, and so then the government like kind of blamed it on Ghanaians who had come for work and kicked out all the Ghanaians. It's where we get this phrase kind of Ghana must go, and there's a bag that's named Ghana must go, which a lot of people put their stuff in when they had to flee the country. And on the other hand, there's also been a period in Ghana's history where things were hard and they also kind of kicked out all of the Nigerians. So there are these, I guess, historical and economic precedents, and then I would say maybe also because of competition and sometimes people feeling, for instance, maybe through the movie industry or music industry, that things are being taken over by Nigerians. There's also this story that we tell that we're the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence. which is not necessarily true. I have a Sudanese friend and they were independent before us, but everybody believes this. We're also kind of the one country that allows Black people to gain citizenship, people from any African country to come and visit without visas. And after we gained independence, our government invested a lot, like financially and politically, in helping other countries gain independence. So based on that, there's this kind of wanting to be the one that like helps everybody and kind of the one country that's safe and calm, etc. So that if people were to visit, they would come through us. And then Nigeria is like the most populous in terms of culture, the most dominant, also in terms of economy, perhaps also like enjoying a boom. So there's wanting to claim that also on that end. I liked that I grew up in a very small town because like you could walk to school by yourself and then walk home with friends. It was like a 10-minute walk. You could play outside. I didn't very much because I was kind of a nerd and would spend all day indoors reading. And I think also kind of my mother is very protective and so preferred that I was kind of where she knew where I was. So moving to a city was, I had always known Accra, like it was where during the summers I would go and visit my cousins. And it always seemed incredibly exciting because it had like bookstores and restaurants and like fast food places, etc. So I moved there when I was about 9. And it was very exciting. It was also very strange, kind of realizing that all of the city kids had all of these references and things that I had to kind of catch up to very quickly. But ultimately, I think it also kind of expanded my sense of like possibilities for what I could do and what I wanted to do. So there's this stereotype people have about West African parents, and it's kind of rooted in truth, that the only acceptable careers are to be a doctor, an engineer, or a lawyer. And it was quite similar with my parents as well. I think it comes out of a place of when they grew up, these were like the careers that would allow you to be able to make money and take care of yourself, and they want this for their children. But I don't think it really applies to my generation anymore. So I think kind of moving to Accra and then moving from different schools and different school systems and syllabi and being exposed to different subjects then kind of helped me figure out what I wanted, be more comfortable in deviating from like the expectations and in disappointing them. And then like by me being more comfortable eventually allowed them, my parents also, to kind of accept what I wanted to do more. So it was a bit of a long journey towards that. But I would say, yeah, apart from the strangeness, kind of moving to the city just helped me also have more references and see more of the country and the world. It's interesting because then I think in a way it kind of then became a thing where we had moved, for instance, from Nigeria to Ghana when I was little. Then we moved to this town, and then we moved to Accra. And then I think actually since then I would like move a lot. So maybe it was also kind of the beginning of me like leaving a place and being like, okay. Because I think since then I lose count, but I've moved maybe in the past 9 years. I think I've lived in like 7 countries or something like that. And actually now I've been in Berlin for almost 3 years, and it's the longest I've ever been in a place in a while. So yeah, at the moment, I don't think I thought about it too much, but maybe it was a preparation for something. And then I left, I guess, properly after high school. I had applied to universities in the States for 2 reasons. One, just because by then I was realizing that I was more interested in kind of arts, humanities, social sciences, and those are not really, it's changed now, but those were not really kind of practically respected as career options. And so I felt like opportunities for me to learn in those subjects also weren't as much. I even had this in my high school where I was one of the top students in my grade, and so when it came to choosing subjects, I remember once having to have an argument with like the curriculum coordinator and the vice principal, because I didn't want to do maths or science, which is kind of what the top students are supposed to do, and I was interested in history or French, etc. So I just felt like maybe I would have more freedom to not be a science student if I left. The second reason was more of a financial one, where for a lot of US colleges there were scholarships available. And by then, one, like my mother didn't have so much money from having raised the five of us. And my father had spent a lot of money on my high school, and so I kind of knew that there was nothing left for university. So how that came about is my four siblings had gone to this high school that my mother and her siblings and her cousins and everyone else before her had gone to. And I wanted to go to this other private high school. Again, because I knew that people who went to this place usually did well. And so I think when I was about 9, I had asked my dad, he would come to Ghana once in a while, and I'd asked him if he would save up money so that when I was 14, I could go to this high school. And apparently he had had this dream that one of his kids would go to Harvard, and I was the last one and hadn't been to university yet. So we made a deal that if he saved up money and paid for this high school, which for 4 years I think cost more than high school and university for my four siblings combined. But we made a deal that if he saved and if he paid for it, I would go to Harvard. I didn't think I would get in. I almost was not going to apply because my high school, because it costs a lot to send applications and postage and everything, they give you 10 free applications. And I remember having a conversation in the car park with my sister once, because I had just agreed with my father because I knew it was what I needed to say for him to say yes, but I didn't think it would actually happen because I didn't know anybody who had gone to Harvard. And so I remember also thinking that it was a waste of an application and that I should apply to somewhere where I had a better chance. And yeah, I remember telling this to my sister, and she's like, no, like you promised, you have to at least apply, and then you can say you didn't get in and it wasn't your fault. And so I thought that that was what would happen. So yeah, it was very strange that I actually got in. I didn't really expect to. My father would say that he knew all along, and he takes credit for that. But yeah, it was very strange. It was exciting, but it was strange. Yeah, I think like retroactively, for instance, one of the first things we attended was an orientation for international students. And it was really helpful because kind of through that I could meet especially other African students. And we were very close, and I'm still kind of in touch with some of my friends then. But I think also another thing that happened then is I gravitated to another thing that felt familiar, which was a lot of the kind of Christian student groups on campus. Because growing up, I think we're kind of very culturally Christian, where everybody goes to church, etc., even though they may or may not believe. So that was another space that I was in a lot in undergrad. I think towards the end, or like a year later, I kind of realized that, because I was never raised like very strongly Christian, it was more of like a social thing and a comfort thing. So I gravitated towards that, but there were some aspects of it later that I realized were not really me. Like there were some teachings about like the role of women, for instance, etc., or how they would talk about like being missionaries in other countries or other people of color that were uncomfortable. So by the end, I would say it was then that I started to unravel like what it had meant in Ghana was very different from how it was being practiced in the US, and the things that were attached to religion, like I didn't like being, for instance, like anti-abortion or anti-like LGBT community, etc. So that was also like a growing curve. It's tricky to say because I don't want to be mean, and I think like the aspect of community was very familiar, especially for international students. Yeah, but then it just got tied up in a lot of like weird ways in which religion is politicized in America. That was strange, and I think that ultimately led me to become not religious. I often wonder if I had never left Ghana and kind of encountered that, what would happen? Yeah. There's this thing about when you're not home for a while, and then you go back and you realize like a lot of things have changed so quickly. And so when you're away, there's the image of home that you have in your mind, and you kind of expect it to be the same. And then you go back and you realize that like, just as you've kept going, your home has also kept going. So I don't think that I would say like I changed and I didn't fit anymore. I think I kind of acknowledged that I was changing, and also Accra and like Ghanaian society in general is changing. And so it would more be like when I go back, like with a person, I imagine like getting to know each other again. But I don't think it was necessarily my perspective. And in terms of me, I think maybe because I always had this with being like Ghanaian and Nigerian, and on my Ghanaian side, coming from a group that's not majority in the country, I think I had always had this experience anyway of being a bit strange. And so now I feel that I'm strange in a different way, but the strangeness itself is not new. It's called Ewe. So we are found in the east, the southeast of the country, split between Ghana and Togo. So actually it was a German colony. And then after, because fun fact, I found out like my two great-grandfathers had like really German names, like Gustav and Willem or something, or Henrik. Anyway, so after the war, it got split between the British and the French. And so half are in Ghana and half are in Togo. So for instance, my grandfather is from the part in Ghana and my grandmother is from the part in Togo. And so there's a lot of like, one, we're one of the many minorities, because most of the country, about 60%, is from this Akan group that kind of dominates or tries to what it means to be Ghanaian. And then specific to us, because we joined with the plebiscite in the 50s, sometimes there are the accusations that like, which are not true, that Ewe people did not fight for independence and just joined afterwards, etc. But again, yeah, it's not true. There's actually documented evidence of people like joining the struggle. But yeah, because of that, there are also stereotypes about like Ewe people being, I don't know, cheap or cheating or only looking after themselves or like with witchcraft, etc. I think that also affected, for instance, in Ghana we have these day names where everybody has a name based on, that tells you what day of the week they were born and whether they're male or female. And so, instance, for my middle name, which is Ghanaian, there's a version that's like specifically Ewe. And my mother instead gave me like the version of that name that is more Akan. It's one letter difference, but I think it was also part of like, okay, it's more recognizable as Ghanaian if it sounds more like the majority version of the name. So it manifests in different ways, and there's also complaints about a lot of Ewe people my generation don't speak the language because their parents may not have taught them, because it's better to speak English or whatever else. In school, we mostly talk about history in terms of the arrival of the Portuguese, etc., and then like colonialism and everything after. We don't really talk about local history much. So it's also just, and there are other like implications of this. For instance, when I was little, I couldn't kind of imagine Black people in the past like being or thinking or speaking or doing anything. It was kind of tied to like arrival of Europeans. But even then, not in much detail, so I had never also been able to connect it to myself or to my family, etc. So I think these are all kind of things that I'm learning or like trying to put together later on. The fact that I've grown up with my first language being English because, for reasons, my parents insisted on teaching us English to have a better chance in life. And that before then, like my grandmother's cousins, for instance, speak French. And then like a generation just before that they might have spoken German. So it's also interesting. I guess before us, the general thread would have been that at least everybody spoke Ewe. But in my case and my siblings, because we weren't taught, also kind of how that isn't really a thread anymore. I had always known that I would one day want to do a PhD, but by then I had been in school a lot. And I kind of wanted a break from being a student and having exams. So I think I was on Facebook one day and I saw this job in Berlin. So I applied. I'd never been to Germany. I didn't really know anything about Germany or about Berlin. But like I said, like I usually kind of move with opportunities. And so I got the job and it was a salary, so okay, I came. Yeah. And yeah, this is kind of how it followed since. I would say here it's often institutional. So for instance, funny story, but when I moved, again without realizing, I was living in Wedding in the African Quarter on like Zanzibarstraße, and then I was working in Mitte on Emstraße. And so for instance, realizing that these like streets that I'm moving between every day have like very racist histories. I was working in a place that studied museums, and so going to some of these museums, for instance, for work and how they presented and described African art. I think it's a moment where like decolonization, for instance, is very popular. And so there would be instances where something is presented as being decolonial or radical, but actually the way that it's engaging Africa still feels very like a violation for me being in those spaces. So here I think it's more kind of going into institutions or frameworks and seeing how they're like presenting or engaging with African people in a way that seems very dehumanizing. So it's more kind of learning to deal with and adjust to that. And maybe that's another thing here that I feel like I have friends who are willing to like, I don't really like the word ally, but who are willing to kind of step up and deal with it so that I don't have to. So that's been nice. And I think, I guess it's more of a trade-off here where there's still like a lot of kind of racist and colonial things in the society, but I think it's kind of freer in other ways, in terms of like, there's still some complications with acceptance of women, queer people, etc. But I think it's free in other ways. Like one thing I have loved about Berlin is I say often that everybody is strange here, and so nobody is strange. And so that's something that I've liked a lot. And then also just kind of coming into realizing eventually that I'm going to be a filmmaker and an artist anyway. There have been a lot of avenues to exchange with people. So for instance, I'm making like an audio piece about the Emstraße, and that comes from my experience kind of living and working there. And through that I would kind of tell some stories about racism, colonialism, etc. Or with tracing this story with my own family, I would kind of use that as my in, and then through telling that story, hopefully I would kind of, people by watching whatever I make would get to some conclusions about like how I feel about racism, colonialism again. So I think, and maybe this applies to my writing as well, but maybe in general, yeah, I don't think for now anyway that I'm like, I guess, activist in that sense of people who are dealing with this on a daily basis, but more, I connect to it through stories, and so I want to tell those stories, and then maybe through people following along with me, they will end up in the same spaces and with the similar conclusions. I guess one thing about like trying to think of myself as an artist since moving to Berlin is there's a lot of reflection about like what it is that you're doing and how you're doing it. And so I have realized in looking back at that actually a lot of the things that I am working on in some way come back to this question about like what the history with Europe and Africa has been, or with the US and Africa, and kind of how we like think about that and how we memorialize that. So even if I'm not kind of directly addressing that, it is at the center of what I'm doing. I come back to this a lot, but the fact that I couldn't really imagine Black people existing because I was not really told stories about Black people, or did not really see, there was not a lot about lives that people had led to show them as people. So I think on the one hand, I make things that are kind of very critical of how we engage with history, but I'm also then interested in just like chronicling like lives of Afro-diasporic people now. And maybe this will, and I think a lot of people are doing similar work, and so that hopefully, I don't know, in a few years' time or 100 years or whatever, there will kind of be more things that people look at, and I'd like to hope that this would not be a problem for somebody like me in a few years' time. And in relation to that also, like I try to pay attention to the perspective and like how I'm telling these stories. Because I mentioned kind of being very uncomfortable by how, when I go to some of these museums, how they're presenting Africa and Black people, because I think the framing is also very strange. As like, it's very strange and exoticized, and it makes me feel like I'm not the audience, like it's presenting these stories for a white audience and for a German audience, etc., whatever that would mean. And so it's also very important, and I'm still trying to figure out how, but kind of who primarily I'm addressing myself and my work to, so that hopefully somebody who sees whatever I make, somebody like me would not have the same sense of being pushed away from it. I only meant to be in Berlin for 2 years, and then last year was a horrible time to move, and so I didn't. And because I didn't, something changed in me, because like I said, I had always moved kind of depending on wherever there was an opportunity, then I would go, because that is how I would make a living. So it was the first time I had kind of just stayed somewhere just because. And it's also kind of me realizing that I can just choose where I want to be and realizing that I do like where I am and I do like Berlin. So I think as things kind of open up and it becomes possible to move, I also just have to think a lot more about like, I can stay where I want to stay. So this is new. But that's in terms of like geography, etc. In terms of what I will do, I think I'm still figuring it out. So kind of I have like backgrounds, I guess, in like research through anthropology and history and in filmmaking. And I think the past years from being here, I'm realizing what it means to like think of myself as an artist, etc. So I think I will keep navigating those. I don't know if I will necessarily land anywhere. I think now it seems kind of where I will land primarily is that I am somebody who tells stories, and then depending on the story I will choose like how it makes sense to tell it. But this is, I think, as much as I know now, and I think the past year with a lot of just not being able to determine things. I'm usually somebody who plans a lot, like 5 years in advance, etc. But I think I'm also becoming kind of more comfortable with not knowing where things are going to go. Yeah.